Officer Nathan Harker's job was routine. So routine, in fact, that sometimes the hours on his late-night patrol blended into a blur of empty streets and the faint glow of street lights. Hillstead was a small, quiet town where nothing ever happened. The kinds of crimes that made headlines elsewhere seemed to bypass this forgotten little corner of the world. 10 years on the force had taught Nathan to expect monotony, and for the most part, he welcomed it. But that evening, as he signed on for his shift, something was different. Dispatch handed him a new patrol route. It wasn't something that Nathan thought twice about at first. Patrol routes changed from time to time, rotated between officers. But when he scanned the map, his stomach tightened. It was a stretch of road on the outskirts of town, winding through the woods and around the old Hillstead Cemetery, the forgotten borderland where the town's collective memory seemed to stop. Nathan had heard the stories. Everyone had. 20 years ago, 5 people vanished without a trace in that very area. The locals still talked about it in hushed whispers, but with no leads, no suspects, and no bodies, the case had gone cold. That strip of road had gained an unsettling reputation. Nobody went there unless they had to. Routine, Nathan muttered to himself as he pulled his cruiser out of the station. Just another patrol. The woods closed in around him as he left the main part of town behind. The tall skeletal trees stretching overhead like fingers reaching out to blot out the night sky. The road was cracked and uneven, barely maintained, with potholes that jarred his cruiser every few hundred yards. His headlights cut through the dark, casting eerie shadows that danced just out of sight. Nathan felt a heaviness in the air, as though the darkness here was thicker, almost tangible. He turned on the radio, letting the faint hum of static and distant voices fill the silence. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone out there. Every so often he caught something in his peripheral vision, a flash of movement in the trees, a shape that didn't quite belong. But when he turned to look, there was nothing. Just nerves, he told himself. It had been a long day. A sudden movement in the road ahead snapped his attention back to the wheel. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as the cruiser skidded to a halt. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A figure stood by the side of the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, a vague outline in the beam of his headlights. Nathan felt a strange jolt of unease, a primal instinct, like the one that tells you something dangerous is near, even before your mind can comprehend it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unnervingly still. Nathan's hand hovered over his radio. He hesitated, then let his fingers relax. He wasn't about to call in something he couldn't explain. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, he threw the car into reverse and backed up slowly, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The figure remained motionless as he approached. With his flashlight in hand, Nathan stepped out of the cruiser, the cold night air prickling his skin. His breath fogged in the beam of his flashlight as he aimed it toward the figure. But there was nothing. The road was empty. No sign of anyone, no footprints, no rustling in the trees, just the oppressive quiet of the woods. Nathan swept his light across the roadside, but it revealed only tall, swaying grass and gnarled tree roots clawing their way out of the earth. His pulse slowed, though the knot of anxiety remained tight in his gut. He turned back toward his car, muttering to himself about overactive imaginations and too much caffeine. As he pulled the cruiser back onto the road, he kept glancing in his rearview mirror. Even though he knew it was foolish, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, just beyond the reach of his lights. The rest of the night passed without incident, though the unease lingered. The woods seemed to press in closer with each passing mile. Every now and then the radio would crackle with static, a brief burst of noise that sent a chill down Nathan's spine before fading back into silence. When his shift finally ended, Nathan returned to the station, feeling more exhausted than he should have been. His colleague, Officer Daniels, gave him a sideways glance as Nathan handed over the keys to the cruiser. "Everything all right, Harker?" Daniels asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Nathan forced a chuckle, but it felt hollow in his throat. "Just the usual night shift blues," he replied, trying to play it off. "Too much coffee, not enough sleep." Daniels grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Careful out there. It gets strange at night, doesn't it?" Nathan nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. As he left the station, he couldn't help but think back to that figure by the roadside. Had it really been nothing? Or had someone, been watching him from the shadows? The next few nights followed a similar pattern. Nathan drove the same route, patrolling the same desolate stretch of road. Each night, the woods felt darker, more oppressive, and each night the sense of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes his radio would flicker with bursts of static that didn't seem to come from anywhere. And sometimes, just at the edge of his vision, he would see it again. The figure, always standing still, always watching him. Each time it vanished the moment he tried to get closer, like a ghost retreating back into the shadows. But the sightings became more frequent, and the oppressive silence of the woods seemed to carry a weight now, something that pressed down on Nathan's chest and made it hard to breathe. Soon he started losing sleep, his dreams haunted by that shadowy figure. He saw it standing at the edge of his bed, watching him with dark, empty eyes. He woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, but when he turned on the light, there was nothing there, just his empty bedroom, the quiet hum of the world outside. But the dreams left a lingering sense of dread, and Nathan started dreading his shifts. The patrol route had become a living nightmare, and the more he drove it, the more convinced he became that something was out there, something old, something hungry, and it was getting closer. By the end of the week, Nathan was no longer thinking about facts and logic. He wasn't thinking about how ghosts and monsters didn't exist, how the woods were just trees, and the shadows were just shadows. He wasn't thinking about how things like that didn't happen to people like him, people who lived in the real world, because he knew, whatever it was that he saw, it was real, and it was waiting for him. In the last quiet moments of his shift, Nathan caught sight of the figure again, this time closer than ever before. It stood in the middle of the road, its face hidden by shadow. But as Nathan approached, something felt different. This time, the figure didn't vanish. This time, it started walking toward him. Nathan's heart raced as he gripped the steering wheel, his hands slick with sweat. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to drive away and never look back. But some force, some invisible pull, kept him rooted in place, watching as the figure came closer and closer. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Nathan gasped, feeling the tension release from his chest, as if he had been underwater and was finally allowed to breathe. His mind spun with confusion, fear, and disbelief. But one thought remained clear as day. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished with him. and he wasn't sure he would survive what came next. Hillstead rarely had any real emergencies, at least not the kind that sent adrenaline rushing through Officer Nathan Harker's veins. After his unsettling encounters during the recent night patrols, he had begun to expect the eerie quiet of the outskirts, though it never sat well with him. But that night, as he sat idly in his cruiser parked near the edge of town, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 1 to 3, we've got a report of possible screaming in the old Decker house. Over, the dispatcher said, her voice wavering slightly. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. He knew the Decker house. Everyone did. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot just like the land surrounding it. The house was a relic from a time before the disappearances, before Hillstead had slowly succumbed to decay. It stood alone on the far edge of the town, hidden away by towering, overgrown trees that swallowed it whole. The locals avoided it, the kids dared each other to go near it, and even the few remaining squatters had long since moved on. It was, in a word, cursed. Nathan gripped the radio. "Copy that, dispatch." "I'm en route," he replied, though a shiver ran down his spine. He didn't like the thought of going there, especially not after what had been happening on his recent patrols. But it was his duty. As he drove toward the Decker house, the air grew thick with mist, swirling around the car like tendrils reaching for something warm to hold on to. Nathan's headlights sliced through the haze, barely illuminating the road ahead. The trees seemed closer, as though they were leaning in, suffocating the path. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. The radio was dead quiet now, except for the occasional crackle of static. No follow-up from dispatch, no other calls coming through. Just the empty hum of the ether. It felt like the world outside the cruiser had disappeared, leaving him alone in a liminal space, an eerie purgatory. Nathan approached the Decker house, the dark silhouette of the building slowly emerging through the mist. It was worse than he remembered. The roof sagged like a tired beast, its windows shattered and gaping like empty eyes. Vines crawled up the sides of the house, strangling it, holding it in place like it was some long-forgotten prisoner. The surrounding forest had reclaimed most of the land, and the entire area was cloaked in an unnatural silence, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Nathan parked the cruiser a few yards away from the house and cut the engine. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, immediately feeling the cold night air settle around him like a weight. His breath fogged in front of him as he approached the sagging front porch, his boots crunching on the overgrown weeds. The faint sound of sobbing reached his ears. It was coming from inside the house. His heart began to race as he quickened his pace, trying to steel himself for what lay ahead. The front door creaked open under the pressure of his hand, and the smell of mildew and damp earth hit him like a wall. The air inside was colder than outside, with a suffocating stillness that made every step echo like a gunshot. Nathan swept his flashlight across the front hallway. The floorboards were warped and rotting, the walls covered in grime and peeling wallpaper. The sobbing continued, growing louder as Nathan ventured deeper into the house. His flashlight beam caught dust motes dancing lazily in the air, disturbed by his movement. It was the only sign of life in the otherwise deathly stillness. "Nathan, to dispatch," he whispered into his radio. "I've arrived at the Decker house. I'm hearing crying. Possible victim inside. Over." Only static replied. He tried again, but the radio remained dead. Nathan frowned, swallowing hard as a deep sense of isolation crept in. There was no turning back now. He followed the sound of the sobbing up a narrow staircase, each step groaning beneath his weight. The darkness seemed to grow thicker the higher he climbed, swallowing his flashlight beam whole. Nathan felt his skin prickle as he reached the second floor, the air even colder up here. Unnatural, like a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The sobbing was close now. He could hear it just behind a door at the end of the hallway, barely cracked open. His pulse quickened as he approached, his hand hovering over his gun. He pushed the door open, the old wood creaking loudly in the oppressive silence. The room was empty. Nathan swept the beam of his flashlight across the space. It was completely bare, no furniture, no curtains, nothing but dust and shadows. Yet the sobbing continued, echoing through the air, as if it were coming from the very walls themselves. He stepped further into the room, his every nerve on edge. The sobbing stopped. Then, all at once, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. Nathan spun around, heart racing, his flashlight flickering. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic flared in his chest as he tried the radio again. Nothing but static. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, sending a chill down his spine. The sound was indecipherable, like a language lost to time. Nathan turned, sweeping the flashlight across the room once more, desperate to find the source of the noise. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe as the whispering grew louder, filling his ears with words that he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Then from behind him came the unmistakable sound of a breath. A slow, deliberate exhalation, so close it raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Nathan froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, knowing he wasn't alone in the room anymore. His flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the room into complete darkness. Nathan's heart hammered against his ribs as he fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it to work. In the darkness, he could hear the whispering again, closer now, surrounding him. He felt a cold draft against his skin, like something was moving around him, circling him, waiting. Finally, the flashlight sputtered back to life, casting its weak beam across the floor. Nathan staggered backward toward the door, his eyes darting around the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. He grabbed the doorknob again and yanked it with all his strength. This time it gave way. He stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath as he slammed the door behind him. The sobbing had stopped, and so had the whispering, but the house felt no less menacing. It was as though the very walls were alive, watching him with unseen eyes, waiting for him to slip, to fall back into their grasp. Nathan didn't stop until he was back in his cruiser, the cold air outside feeling like salvation compared to the unnatural cold inside the house. His hands trembled as he started the car, his pulse still pounding in his ears. He drove away without looking back, the road blurring in the haze of mist and fear. The Decker house vanished into the darkness behind him, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Back at the station, Nathan filled out the report in terse, minimalistic details, leaving out the parts that would make him sound insane. The sobbing, the cold, the slamming door, that could all be explained. But the whispers, the presence he had felt in that room, he couldn't bring himself to write those down. He spent the rest of the night in a daze, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination, that the house wasn't haunted by something malevolent, that he wasn't slowly losing his grip on reality. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever had been in that house hadn't stayed behind. It had followed him out, and it was waiting for the next time it could make its move. The night had a way of stretching on endlessly when you were alone on patrol. For Officer Nathan Harker, the late hours had grown heavier over the past few weeks. Ever since his encounter at the Decker house, an unease had settled deep into his bones, something more oppressive than the usual strain of night shifts. The town of Hillstead had always been quiet after dark. Too quiet, but now it felt as though the silence was thick with secrets, teeming with shadows that moved just out of sight. Nathan's sleep had become fitful, haunted by fragments of that night. Cold whispers brushed the edges of his dreams, and more often than not he woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing as though he had been running from something. He hadn't told anyone about the full extent of what happened at the Decker house. Who would believe him? Not the guys at the station, who would laugh it off as nerves, or his wife, Hannah, who already worried about the toll his job was taking on him. But there was something else now. Something worse, gnawing at his mind like a dark rot, spreading through his thoughts. Every night on his patrols, he felt watched. Tonight was no different. Nathan was driving the outskirts again, just past the cemetery and toward the old industrial park, when dispatch radioed in. Unit 1 to 3, report of a break-in at 402 Ash Lane. Resident claims they saw an intruder in a police uniform. Responding officers requested. Over. A break-in wasn't unusual. The description of the intruder, however, sent a jolt of apprehension through Nathan's chest. Someone dressed as a cop. The implications were troubling. Hillstead was small, and its police force even smaller. There weren't any rogue officers roaming the streets, at least none that Nathan knew of. But that image stuck in his mind. Another officer, a reflection of himself, lurking in the night. He responded with a clipped acknowledgement into the radio and flipped the lights on. As he drove toward Ash Lane, the fog thickened, swirling in the beams of his headlights. The unease returned, settling in his gut like a stone. Every corner of the town felt haunted these days, every street hiding something just beyond reach. Nathan arrived at the address, his tires crunching over gravel. The house was dark, its windows reflecting the sickly glow of his cruiser's headlights. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows or doors ajar. He stepped out of the car and radioed in his arrival. Unit 1 to 3, I'm on scene at 402 Ash Lane. No visual on intruder yet. We'll investigate. Over. The air was cold, the mist clinging to the ground in thick tendrils. Nathan moved cautiously toward the house, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed still, too still. He felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle, a familiar sense of being watched creeping in. He forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on the job. As he approached the front steps, he heard the faint crackle of a radio nearby. His first instinct was relief. Backup had arrived. Another officer was already here, maybe inside the house. He called out, "Hillstead PD, who's there?" But there was no answer, only the static hum of the radio, distant and broken. Nathan's pulse quickened. He stepped around the side of the house, scanning the yard. A figure stood at the edge of the property, half hidden in the fog, facing away from him. Nathan's heart leaped into his throat. It was a police officer dressed in full uniform, Tall, broad-shouldered, a silhouette eerily similar to his own. The officer was motionless, standing with his back to Nathan, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something in the distance. His hand hovered near his radio, though no words came from it, just static. Nathan felt a surge of confusion and apprehension. Why hadn't the officer responded? Was this the intruder the homeowner had called about? "Hey," Nathan called out, his voice echoing into the mist. "Hillstead PD, show me your badge." The figure didn't move. For a long, unnerving moment, it was as though Nathan's voice hadn't even reached him. Then, slowly, the officer turned. Nathan felt his blood run cold. The man's face, no, his face, was staring back at him. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. Same jawline, same short-cropped hair, same piercing eyes that Nathan had seen every day in the mirror for years. He was looking at himself. The doppelgänger's eyes were empty, though hollow in a way that made Nathan's skin crawl. "Oh, what the hell?" Nathan whispered, instinctively reaching for his gun. The phantom officer smiled, just a small, twisted curve of the lips that sent a bolt of terror through Nathan's chest. The doppelgänger raised his hand in a mockery of a greeting, but something was wrong with the movement. It was too smooth, too mechanical, as though it were mimicking Nathan's every gesture without truly understanding it. Nathan blinked hard, his breath catching in his throat. This couldn't be real. Stress, lack of sleep, the horror of the Decker house, it had all finally caught up to him. He was hallucinating. That had to be it. But when he opened his eyes again, the phantom officer was still there. His dark eyes glinted with something malicious, something that made Nathan's skin crawl. He took a step back, gripping his radio. "Unit 1 to 3 to dispatch," Nathan's voice shook as he spoke. "Requesting backup at 402 Ash Lane." "Officer impersonation. Suspect is armed and dangerous. Repeat, suspect is..." The radio cut out mid-sentence, filling with a wash of static so loud it made Nathan wince. He shook it, tried the signal again, but there was nothing. Just that same crackle of dead air. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back up, only to find the phantom officer was no longer there. The yard was empty. The fog had swallowed him whole. Nathan scanned the area frantically, his flashlight cutting through the mist. How could he have just disappeared? There was nowhere to go. The yard was fenced in, the house still sealed. And yet, the phantom was gone. Nathan swallowed hard and took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic. He wasn't losing his mind. He couldn't be. But then, how could he explain what he had just seen? He walked back toward his cruiser, his mind reeling. He had to think, had to figure this out. He reached for the door handle, but something caught his attention in the rearview mirror, a shadow standing at the edge of the mist, just barely visible in the dim light. Nathan froze, his eyes locked on the reflection. The phantom officer was there again, standing still as stone, watching him with that eerie, hollow gaze. His smile was gone, replaced by something far more sinister, a look of pure malice that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. This wasn't just an impersonator. This was something else, something darker, something wrong. Before Nathan could react, the figure vanished again, dissolving into the fog as though it had never been there. The yard was empty once more, but the sense of dread remained, thick in the air like a living thing. Nathan sat heavily in his cruiser, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't explain what had just happened. All he knew was that the phantom officer was real. Real in a way that defied logic, real in a way that left a cold pit of fear in his stomach. As he sat there trying to collect himself, his radio crackled to life again. "Unit 1 to 3, came the voice of dispatch, calm and detached. "Be advised we've had reports of a suspicious individual impersonating a police officer in the area. Exercise caution." Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was too afraid to respond, too afraid to turn around again and see the phantom officer standing there, watching him, waiting. The rest of the night was a blur of patrols and half-hearted responses. Nathan's mind was elsewhere, on the phantom, on the impossible reflection of himself that had appeared in the fog. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that whatever he had seen wasn't just a trick of the mind. The phantom officer wasn't gone. Nathan knew that much. He was out there, somewhere, waiting in the shadows. And as Nathan's shift dragged on into the early hours of the morning, he couldn't escape the gnawing sense that the phantom wasn't just following him, it was becoming him. The rain started as a drizzle, soft and unthreatening, but by the time Officer Nathan Harker had reached the outskirts of Hillstead, it had transformed into a torrent. Sheets of water lashed against his windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The road ahead blurred into a slick, black ribbon, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. The fog, thick and creeping, clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling with a sinister purpose. It was as though the entire world was conspiring to keep him from reaching his destination. But Nathan couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He knew where he had to go. The Decker house, the place where it had all begun. The house had taken root in his mind like a festering wound, growing more potent, more insidious with each passing day. The whispers, the shadows, the phantom officer. All of it was connected to that house. It had become a place of power for whatever dark force had latched onto him. And tonight, Nathan intended to end it once and for all. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as the memory of that night flashed through his mind, the icy whispers curling around him, the door slamming shut, trapping him in that nightmare of darkness and cold. Ever since that night, he had been haunted, not just by the house, but by himself. The phantom officer had started appearing more frequently, always lurking just at the edge of Nathan's vision, a mockery of his existence. At first, it had been a shadow, a fleeting figure that disappeared when Nathan tried to confront it. But over time, it had become more corporeal, more real. The doppelgänger no longer merely followed Nathan. It now mirrored his every move, his every thought, growing bolder with each encounter. And lately, it had begun invading his life in ways that terrified him. The phantom officer would stand at the foot of his bed in the dead of night, staring down at him with empty eyes, or appear in the reflection of a shop window as Nathan walked by, smiling that sick, twisted smile. It had become more than just an apparition. It had become a threat. It was no longer content to haunt him. Now it wanted to replace him. Nathan's breath hitched as he caught sight of the house through the rain, looming up ahead like a hulking beast. The windows were dark, the roof sagging under the weight of decades of decay. But the presence, the malignant force that seemed to seep from its very walls, was palpable. It crawled under his skin, making the air around him feel thick and suffocating. The car rumbled to a stop, tires sliding slightly on the wet gravel. Nathan sat in silence for a moment, staring at the house through the windshield, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the final confrontation. He wasn't sure if he would survive this night, but he knew there was no turning back now. He stepped out of the cruiser, the rain instantly soaking him to the bone. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he approached the house, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though something was pulling him back, trying to drag him down into the earth. The closer he got, the more the whispers returned, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but growing louder with every beat of his heart. Nathan reached the porch, his hands shaking as he gripped the door handle. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Was he ready for this? Could he really face what awaited him inside? He had no choice. He had to end this, or it would end him. He threw the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and rot, just as it had been that first night, but this time it was worse, almost unbearable. The darkness inside the house was oppressive, closing in around him like a living thing. Nathan swept his flashlight across the hallway, half expecting to see the phantom officer standing there, waiting for him. But the house was empty, silent, and yet he could feel it, watching him. Nathan moved cautiously through the house, his every step echoing in the stillness. The whispers grew louder, curling around him like tendrils of smoke, seeping into his mind. He heard his name over and over, in voices that were familiar yet distorted, twisted versions of his own thoughts, twisted versions of his own memories. Nathan, come home. Nathan, it's time. He reached the staircase, the same one he had climbed that night when the house had first tried to claim him. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step more difficult than the last. It felt as though the house was resisting him, trying to drag him down, trying to make him turn back. But Nathan pushed forward, his determination hardening with each step. At the top of the stairs, the door to the room stood slightly ajar, just as it had before. Nathan's heart raced as he approached it, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around him in a cacophony of madness. He pushed the door open. The room was empty save for the old chair in the center, just as it had been that night. But this time the air was colder, darker. Shadows clung to the walls like malevolent spirits, watching, waiting. And then from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. The phantom officer. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The doppelgänger stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, mirroring Nathan's own. It wore the same uniform, the same badge, the same face, but its eyes, those cold, empty eyes, were filled with something dark, something hungry. The phantom officer smiled, that same twisted smile that had haunted Nathan's nightmares for weeks. It raised a hand in greeting, but there was no warmth in the gesture, only mockery. "Nathan," the phantom said in a voice that was both his and not his, "it's time to let go. It's time to rest." Nathan shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're just a shadow. You don't belong here." The phantom officer laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a shiver down Nathan's spine. "I am more real than you know," it said, stepping closer. "I've always been here, Nathan, always watching, always waiting. And now, it's my turn." Nathan raised his gun, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I won't let you take me." The phantom officer's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something more malevolent. "You can't stop me," it whispered, its voice like ice in Nathan's veins. "I'm already inside you. I'm already part of you. Every time you look in the mirror, you see me. Every time you close your eyes, I'm there. You can't escape me, Nathan. I am you." Nathan's finger trembled on the trigger, his mind spinning with confusion and fear. The phantom officer took another step forward, its eyes locking with Nathan's. "Let me in," it whispered. "Let me take the pain away." Nathan hesitated, his heart racing. For a moment he wavered, the darkness threatening to consume him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with doubt, with fear. The gun in his hand felt heavy, like an anchor pulling him down. But then something broke through the fog of fear. A memory. Hannah's face, her smile, the life they had built together. The life that was his, not this thing's, not this shadow. "No," Nathan whispered, his voice gaining strength. "You're not me." With a roar of defiance, Nathan pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the house, deafening in the silence. The phantom officer staggered back, its smile faltering, its eyes wide with shock. For a moment, everything was still. Then the phantom officer began to dissolve. Its body flickered like an old television losing signal, its form unraveling into smoke and shadow. It let out a final, low hiss of rage before vanishing completely, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. Nathan stood there, panting, his heart racing in his chest. The house felt different now, lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. The whispers were gone. The shadows had retreated. He lowered the gun, his hands still shaking, and turned to leave the room. But as he stepped out into the hallway, he caught a glimpse of himself in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. His reflection stared back at him, eyes hollow, a twisted smile curling at the edges of his lips. And then it was gone. Nathan blinked, his breath catching in his throat. He shook his head, forcing himself to look away. The house was still now, quiet. The nightmare was over. But as Nathan stepped outside, the rain washing over him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out. Something dark, something that would always be there, just out of sight, waiting. And deep down, he knew the truth. The phantom wasn't gone. It never would be.